With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah, Daf Lev, Daf Lamed Beis. We left off 5 lines from the top of the Amid. We were learning the Shita of Shmuel, that cutting a rope of a keli is not soiser, not even midrabanan. We did learn a Beitzah that appears to be holding the opposite of it, and we're going to we're going to review the Shita of Rebbe Nehemiah, which is a very stringent opinion when it comes to the rules of Muktzah, and that is that a person is not allowed to handle, to be metaltal, to move any keli for any purpose other than for what it was primarily made for. That's a very high standard of Muktzah, and not only do we say that on Shabbos, but he holds that's even the case on Yom Tov. We're going to learn a Mishnah that's going to teach us various detailed dinim regarding tikkun mana, that we're not allowed to make a utensil, including taking even a small clump of potter's clay and pressing your fist into it, making some sort of indentation that you will use either to put oil in, which is really a very inferior keli, because when you have just a piece of clay, before you put it into a kiln, before you harden it, putting oil into it actually will probably melt away. It's going to just eat up the entire clay. People sometimes would put coins in it. Be that as it may, we're going to learn our Mishnah that holds that you may not do that, not even on Yom Tov, because yes, even though it's inferior, but you are creating a utensil on Yom Tov, which is prohibited. We're going to, because of the din of the Mishnah, Tikkun Mana, we're going to learn some rules regarding flat earthenware concerning the dinim of Tuma and Tara. I know that people are more familiar with Pshute Klei Eitz, flat woodware, when it comes to the dinim of Tuma and Tara. But we're going to learn dinim today regarding earthenware. We're going to learn various halachas regarding wicks on Yom Tov. We're going to have a little bit of Agadata on Daf Lamed Beis, Amid Beis, Gimel, Chayehen, Einam Chayim, etc. And we're going to have the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Beis, Amid Beis, that's going to continue to teach us halachas both regarding Tikkun Mana and also regarding Binyan Arai, and many all more detailed halachas regarding Yom Tov. Many of them carry over to Shabbos as well. And again, we're going to start on Daf Lamed Beis, Amid Aleph, 5 lines from the top of the Amid. On Daf Lamed Aleph, Amid Beis, we quoted the Shita of Shmuel. We were learning about Chaysamois Shabakarka. We were learning how one is allowed to untie those ropes that would close doors, because it was never tied with a Kesher Shel Kayama. But then Shmuel said that one may neither unravel them, you may not cut them, right? That's when it is connected to the ground. But if they are of kalim, that was the chiddush of Shmuel, then cutting a rope, it's not soiser, not even midrabanan, not even on Yom Tov. Now, we quoted the Beitzah that clearly says otherwise. Says the Gemara, the Beitzah that we brought in, Toratz Talach Reisha, as we learned above, but the Beitzah that we have on top of the Amid contradicts Shmuel. Seifa is kasha, and like Rashi writes 4 lines from the top of the Amid, to Amar Shmuel on Lamed Aleph Amid Beis, v'shal kelim afilu b'Shabbos matir u'mafkiya v'choyteich. Not only Yom Tov, even Shabbos, which sometimes we are more chomer, we're more machmer on Shabbos than on Yom Tov. V'hai tana tonei v'shal kelim b'Shabbos matir. Because there is, at least on Shabbos, it sounds like there is an issue of being soiser a keli, of demolishing a utensil. So says the Gemara that the Beitzah that does not allow you to cut a rope on a keli, or to open it up on Shabbos, is really following the sheet of Rebbe Nehemiah. What's going to be amazing is that the problem is not the soiser aspect. The problem is that how are you going to cut the rope? By taking a knife. The problem is that you may not handle the knife. Because if we're going to follow the sheet of Rab Nechemia, the Omar, Kol HaKelim Ein Netolim Elo Derech Tashmishon, that no keli can be moved, only for its primary purpose. That's a big chiddush of the Gemara. So even though the Gemara says you may not cut it, it's not because you may not cut it. There's nothing wrong with cutting it. There's no stira by kelim. When you get a package and you open it in a way that you destroy the package, you're not doing anything wrong, not even midrabanan. The problem is simply, how will you get the knife that will cut it? Now, knives were made to cut food. Knives were not made to cut ropes on kelim. And therefore, the knife is muktzah to carry, to do something that it's not its primary purpose. But the problem now is, if it's not about soiser, it's just like a technical thing. The keli to cut it is muktzah. Why does the Beitzah on top of the Amid only aser you unraveling, only aser you cutting? On Shabbos, l'chora, according to Rab Nechemia, there should be no difference. I feel Yom Tov Nami and V'chitema, and if you're going to counter and answer that Shanya Leil Rab Nechemia Bein Shvus Shabbos L'Shvus Yom Tov, just like we had so many times already, that since we see biblically that Hashem was more lenient on Yom Tov for Oichel Nefesh, but therefore Chazal at times were also Bichlal more lenient on Yom Tov, maybe Rab Nechemia, who has this chamur dika concept by muksa, that kol ha-kelim ein netolim el derech tashmishon. Maybe that's only for Shabbos, not for Yom Tov. It's not correct. Umishanyale, does he make such a differentiation? No, he does not. Because v'hatani chada, we learned in one Beitzah, masikin bekelim, that on Yom Tov you can fuel a fire with undamaged kelim. V'ein masikin b'shivrei kelim, but you may not fuel a fire if you have a wooden keli that broke on Yom Tov. And the reason for that was, that's connected to the dinim of muktzah. In other words, if you had a keli, you had a board, when Yom Tov came in, the board was designated, to chop on it. Now that it broke on Yom Tov, you can't change its designation on Yom Tov because it was already muktzah, right? That's the shita that we have continuously from Rebbe Yehuda. Migu de iskatzoy lebein hashmoshes was never designated to use as fuel. However, we learned in another Beitzah, masikin bein bekelim, bein b'shivre kelim. All right, this Tana is lenient like Rab Shimon by muktzah. If right now you can use it for fuel, zum gesund. Now this must be the sheet of Rab Nechemia that holds that since a keli was designated, to be a cup, to be a plate, never designated for fuel, it's muktzah, and umeshane regarding these three Beitzahs, loikasha harab shuda, harab shimon, harab Nechemia, and the Beitzah, the third Beitzah that follows Rab Nechemia, obviously is speaking about Yom Tov. On Shabbos you can't fuel anything. So you see that this shita, this chumrah, that called kelim ein nitolim el derech tashmishon, is even on Yom Tov. So how do you say that the Tana on top of the Amid is Rab Nechemia? The Tana on top of the Amid differentiates between Shabbos and Yom Tov. So the Gemara says it must be Trei Tanoi V'ali b'de Rab Nechemia. And we're holding our ground that no one is going to argue with that, which Shmuel tells us, that by Kalim there is no issue of demolition. Not on Yom Tov, not on Shabbos. The problem that we had in cutting a rope off a keli is because the knife may not be taken to cut the rope. And that's going to be again another source for the practical question regarding opening up packages on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, aside of what we learned above, aside of a potential muktzah, aside of if the package came michutz l'tchum, then you can't do that, then you can't open it up. But then how will you open is also of great significance. On one hand, the ein stira b'kelim means if you destroy the keli while you're opening it, there is no problem. On the other hand, if you need a keli to destroy it, according to Rab Nechemia, you may not do so. No, we don't pass like Rab Nechemia, but we're learning Gemara. And b'toich Rab Nechemia, again, this Trei Tanoi, whether he's going to be machmer only on Shabbos, or whether he's also machmer on Yom Tov. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shahar kol nehemu dvarim.
Rabbi, ein stira b'kelim or ein stira b'packages?
Ein stira b'kelim, including packages. including packages. Okay, says our Mishnah. We're learning more about Tikkun Mana. Don't forget, Tikkun Mana is an Isur De'oraisa. Something that looks like Tikkun Mana is Asur Midrabanan. Says the Mishnah, Ein Poichasin Es Haner. Mepnei Shuhu Oisa Keli. We're speaking, my friends, about a lump of clay and hollowing it out. Poichasin means whether your thumb, whether your fist, you cannot make a receptacle in clay. Now that's a big chumrah, because one can argue that what is this, that's only the first step in making a keli. Now you have to fire it up in a kivshan, in a kiln. Says the Mishnah, no. Even before you fired it up, it's keli enough, and therefore you may not do it, not even on Yom Tov. You may not make charcoal on Yom Tov. Now, guys, I want you to know that now we bake, we prepare food with charcoal. Now, I'm not saying that that's okay, because making charcoal to make food, that's a classical question of machshirei oichel nefesh. Remember machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. In the times of Chazal, charcoal was used to make kalim. For example, when they would make gold, when they would melt gold, they would use charcoal. So you cannot make pechamim on Yom Tov because you're making something that may not be used on Yom Tov. You may not cut a wick. Again, a big chiddush, cutting a wick is considered a tikkun mana. However, Rabbi Yehuda argues, and he says that even though you can't cut it with a knife, but you can't say you can't cut it, because you are allowed to cut it by singeing it, by burning it. The Gemara is going to clarify exactly the case of Rabbi Yehuda's Kula. Let's begin with the Reisha. The Reisha says you may not hollow out a clump of clay. That's called a keli. Says the Gemara, that's not according to everyone. Man Tana, who holds that psichas neir, even though it's not fired up, so it's very weak, is still considered a mana. Mana means a keli. Amar Rab Yosef, that's only Rab Meir. Where do we find the dinim? Where do we find Rab Meir speaking about it? Not concerning Shabbos Yantiv, but concerning the dinim of Tuma and Tara. And a lot of it travels on the same track. An item is only susceptible to becoming Tamei if it's considered a finished product, if it's considered a keli. So says the Beitzah, the Tanya, clay, cheres, earthenware, me'emes amikabel tumam. Says the Tanach Rabbi Meir, mishenigmara malachtoi, from when it's finished. And as you will understand from Rabbi Yeshua, that nigmara malachta doesn't mean when it's fired up. It means the form is completed, even before it was burnt and hardened and affixed. Rabbi Yeshua holds, no, it's not enough for it to just have its form, but then it has to be fired in the kiln, prior to which it's not going to be makabel tuma. So it goes together. So since you see by Rab Meir for tuma and tara, even before mishiyitzrefu lekivshon, it's makabel tuma. That's why you may not make it on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. Amalei Abaye to Rabbi Yosef mimai dilma at kan lekomen of Meir Hassan, that you don't need to harden it. Maybe that's because that, but I was speaking about a very large piece of clay. Therefore, the chazi lekabule beimidei, as the Rishonim speak out, something that's very large won't necessarily be used for liquids. It's big enough, it can be used for solids. Solids won't destroy the form of even a piece of clay. Of course, if it's very heavy, it might, but the texture, it's solid. The Mishnah is speaking about a small lamp. When you put oil into it or any liquid into it, since it wasn't hardened, it's going to ruin it. It's going to become very temporary. Aval hacha, small, lamay chazi, and taka. So the Gemara answers that's not a kasha, because even something small, even if the person did it for a lamp, he doesn't care that after you use it once, it's like disposable, but it could theoretically be used lekabula beipshite, to put coins in it, small coins, and that, not liquid, that is not like she'ena shel kayama, it will last for a long time, so it's considered a keli. Even if you plan to put oil into it, and it's only going to have one use, or two uses, doesn't matter. It's keli enough. You don't need to have the killing, as we find in Tum and Tara. That Rabbi Yosef answered the question, who is the author of our Mishnah? Rabbi Eliezer ben Abtzadiki, the Tanan. And here we're going to Mishnah in Eidiyos. And what does it say in the Mishnah over there? That they testified that ilfasin, which means plates, from Choroniyos, that's a location, we'll see it actually means villages. Now, in those places, villagers were not that sophisticated. And in the process of making plates, let's go through the 3 steps. First, if you're using clay, you have to flatten it out. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is after it's flat, you would make an indentation in it. So it should have a receptacle. And then number 3, you would fire it in a kiln. So ilfasin choroniyos is referring to plates that only underwent the first step. It's flat. Doesn't even have an indentation. So says the Tanach that tohoros ma'oil ameis, it's not even considered the keli at all. If the issue is it going to become susceptible to tumas oil? That not. And as Rashi brings all of the proofs concerning in Parshas Chukas, when the Torah is speaking about tumas oil mace, the Torah used the word koil kli posuach, pesach. All of that implies that it's only going to be mikabel tuma if at least it has an indentation, if it has a receptacle. However, the chiddush is that even though you only underwent step number 1, you only flattened it, you didn't make an indentation, you didn't fire it in the kiln, nevertheless, utemeyos b'masa hazov. If a zav will move it, even indirectly, whether he's carrying it, or as Rashi adds, hesed, with again rayas that it doesn't need to have a receptacle, since people in the villages already use it, let's say to eat on it, to eat something solid, to eat meat, it's considered a keli umakabel tuma. Rabbi Eliezer ben Abtzadik oimer af tohoros b'masa hazov. No, not only is it not makabel tuma soil, it's not even going to become tummy if a zav will carry it, lefi shaloi nigmar malachton, which means this is very important because its form is not finished because you did not yet make an indentation, implying that the moment you made an indentation, even if it wasn't fired in the kiln, then it will be makabel tuma. Here again, you have a source that firing it, hardening it, which is what gives the keli longevity, is not essential for it to be called a keli. So it's makabel tuma, and in our Mishnah, you're going to be breaking Shabbos and Yom Tov, you're making a keli. And here again, Amalei Abayim, Dilma'at kan loika amar Rabbi Eliezer ben Abtzadik, only over there in a duyos, because they're speaking about a large plate, the chazi lekabulde beimidei, and indeed the villagers, they would eat meat on it. According to the Tanach, it's already keli enough to be makabel tumas masa hazov. Avaloch, but over here again, the Mishnah, we understand. Now we're speaking about an oil lamp. Very good. Lamay chazi likabulei bei. Yeah, I know that you plan to put oil in it. So what? The oil is going to completely corrode it. It's not hardened. So the Gemara answers the same concept. Even though you are doing it to put oil in it, and you don't care if it's only going to have a very temporary usage, since you made something that could last if you'll use it for pshite, for coins are not liquid. Even though it wasn't hardened, that's called making a keli, you're not allowed to do it. Tanach Rabbanan Abrais. Elaborating more details of the dinim that we just learned. Number 1, ein poichasenas haner. You may not hollow out a piece of clay to be used as a lamp. Number 2, ve'ein oisin ilfasin choroniyos b'yom tov. You may not make these villagers' plates on Yom Tov. However, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel mater be'ilfasin choroniyos. We're speaking only about stage number 1. In other words, if you're going to hollow it out, if you're going to make an indentation in it, then it's just like the neir. The neir is asur, the plates are asur. He holds that if it's only step number 1, if you only made it flat, it's b'chlal not considered a keli. Now the Gemara is going to ask, what's the meaning of the word choroniyos? Amar Rav Yehuda, ironiyos. What did that help? It helped them. We don't know this nor that. Amar Abaye, plates that are used chak liyasa by villagers who were not that fancy people. They didn't need everything to be shane and finished. For them, once it was already flattened out, they would eat meat on it. Again, pshita. The Mishnah says you can't make coals. Guys, if people would use coals for food, the Gemara wouldn't ask pshita. You know why? Because taka, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that machshirei oichel nefesh is also doiche yamtiv, there would be a chiddush. Now the reason why, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, you won't be allowed to make coals is because you could have made it before yamtiv. Remember that Rabbi Yehuda holds machshirei oichel nefesh is doiche only if you were unable to make it before. The problem is that they bechlal never use charcoal for the making of food. So of course it's asir lamay chazi, that you would use it again. Smiths would use it to make kalim. Answers the Gemara, no. Tani Rabchia, leinitzrecha elo lemoisran leoil yarin, that used to have bath house attendants, and they would warm up water. And you would think that if they are warming it at leboy bayoim to warm up a bath for Yom Tiv, that would be something that maybe, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda, would be permitted. Okay? And if you remember the whole sugi we learned in Shabbos, and the maskana there was that because of stages of rabbinic gezeros, we may not take a hot bath, not on Shabbos. We may, even if the water was warm before, we may not take a hot bath on Yom Tov. By the way, even now, right, mikvah is the exception, right? Don't confuse a bath with a shower. That's a different topic, right? Because there's hot bath, and then there is a cold bath. And again, as we learned, even on Shabbos, in the times of Chazal, you were allowed to take a cold bath. The ending of Masechta Shabbos is a story of an Amoira, a Rav or a Rabba, bathing. Now we don't take a cold bath on Rabba Barafuna, thank you. Now we don't take a cold bath. I just want to separate bath and showers. But coming back over here, that since you can argue that it's a Yom Tov need. Tzalitza, you're not making coals to make metal, to make gold, to melt metals. So that's why you would think that it's allowed. But the Gemara says, but how you're not allowed to bathe? Answers the Gemara that just like Rava said elsewhere, that all of these takanas regarding bathing on Shabbos and on Yom Tov happened at stages. So there was a large period of time where you were not allowed to bathe. Guys, you remember this? But you were allowed to schwitz. That means they were allowed to make a hot sauna for Yom Tov. So they're just like Rava said, also lahazia, and before the gezeda, hachinami, that the reason why the Beitzah needed to say a chiddush that you can't, or the Mishnah said a chiddush that you can't make coals, in the Mishnah this din was written at the time that you were allowed to take a hot schwitz on Yom Tov, and bathhouse attendants needed coals. And it's a Yom Tov need. Nevertheless, you're not allowed to make the coals. And that's even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that machshirei, right, that you're allowed to do it, but you should have done it before Yom Tov. So to go and make the coals on Yom Tov is going to be asur. Says the Mishnah, referring back to the Mishnah, you may not cut the wick into two, and Rabbi Yehuda says that you can cut it with fire, meaning you can't cut it with a knife, but you can cut it with fire. Why? Even Rabbi Yehuda's maida to cut a wick into two parts. Why can't you do it? Because you're rectifying, you're making a keli. Taflam beis amid beis. They're going to sakin mana. Well, oy bazoi, ba'urnami. What difference is there whether you're using a knife or fire? It clarifies the Gemara Tani Rabchia that the case of Rabbi Yehuda is only that if you have two different lamps, you can think about candles that are hard. You can think about oil, like Kevin is itching to put up pictures the whole time over here. So you have oil. You only have one wick. You put the wick in both lamps. When you light that wick in the middle, it doesn't even appear like you're trying to make two lamps. No, you're trying to light the fire. Happens to be that the fire will take a burn and separate the wicks, and now you'll have two lamps. That is something that, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda, you are allowed to do, because your kavanah is not to make a better wick or a smaller wick, or a double wick, your kavanah is already to light the fire. Gewaldig. And the Tanach holds no, that since de facto you will be separating the wick, that will make the wick into a new keli. There was one wick, now you have 2 wicks. That's why the Tanach holds, even if you're separating you're creating the 2 wicks, the wicks by an act of lighting the fire, which, by the way, you could do on Yom Tov, as we'll get to more in the next daf, not make the fire out of nothing, but from a pre-lit fire, we can light another candle. Rabbi Yehuda holds you can do it. Amar Rab Noson bar Abba Amar Rav Moichatenes Apsila b'Yom Tov. You are allowed to trim a wick on Yom Tov. Now that's a problem, because again, now that we established that even a wick is considered the keli, can't cut a wick into 2, so what kind of trimming? Well, how is trimming better than cutting? So the Gemara is going to clarify. My moichatin amarab chanina bar shelemia, either in the name of Rav, or we take out in the name of Rav. It means only la'aduye chushcha, to remove the charcoal, the dark, thick piece of wick that darkens its illumination. As today the wicks are much better, but even today sometimes the wick for some reason is not getting burnt up, so the burnt wick is in the fire, it's diminishing the fire. You can get rid of that charcoal, that fabrente wick. That is what you are allowed to do. That's the moichatin es apsila b'Yom Tov. Now Tana bar Kaporem Gvav Dvarim Nemru b'Psila. There are 6 halachas regarding the wick on Yom Tov. Gimel lahachmir v'gimel lahakal. What's the lahachmir? Number 1, ein goydlin oisa. You may not twist a wick on Yom Tov that betters the wick. That's called making a mana, tikkun mana. You're making a keli. A wick is a keli. Right? You can do it before, but you can't do it on Yom Tov. And go in lechatchila b'Yom Tov. No, just don't think lechatchila means b'di'evad you could. It means you cannot do it on Yom Tov. You have to prepare the wick from before Yom Tov. Number 2, ve'ein mahavavin oisa ba'ur. You may not singe it with fire. Singeing a wick with fire and then putting it out is also a betterment that you are making to the wick. Like we mentioned already when we learned Shabbos, that even though the main mitzvah of lighting candles is incumbent upon Jewish women, and the Rebbe says, and daughters from 3 years old, or from when they make a bracha, maybe even before, nevertheless, it's a mitzvah for the man to be part of. And how are we part of? Either setting up the candles, or there was an old minig that the husband, the father, would singe the wicks and right away put it out. So I guess when the woman lights the candles, it's easier, it chaps even quicker. Many people don't do it nowadays because the wicks are of much better quality, and you lighting it before or not, in many cases, mamish makes no difference. But that was not the case in those days. There, singeing a wick really made a difference, and therefore you're not allowed to do it. It's tikkun mana. And number 3, like we learned in our Mishnah, what you would think a wick is something so little. No, it's a keli, and all of these 3 things is called tikkun mana. However, what are the 3 leniencies lahakel? Number 1, mimacha miyad, that if you have fluffy fibers and you want to simply make it harder, not by twisting it, but by pressing it, by flattening it, that's an unusual way of bettering it. Don't forget, the wick is here. You want to upgrade it. If you upgrade something as a shaloi kadarkai, then you are allowed. Number 2, you are allowed to soak it in oil. Again, you're going to say you're doing something to better it. I know, but that level of betterment is not called tikkun mana. And number 3, as we learned from Rabbi Yehuda, that if there's one wick already in 2 lamps, and you light the middle of it, even though you know that when you do that, it's going to end up burning it and separating it into 2, that's not a problem, because all you are doing is not tikkun mana, you're lighting the fire. We're quoting Rab Nosson Bar Abba because he was quoted above in the 3rd line, right? So we were speaking about the sugya of what could you do to a wick? What can you not do to a wick? He said, Moichatinas apsila. So now we're going to quote from the same Amoida, apparently unrelated topic, that Atire Bavel, that the wealthy Yidden that live in Bavel, Yorde Gehename. Wow. And make no mistake over here, this is not the Amiroim of Eretz Yisrael, right, that they're criticizing the palate, the kutach that they eat in Bavel. This is Rav, the Rav in Bavel, in Surah. And maybe not, maybe Bavel was only that region called Bavel, but he said some words of criticism, that the wealthy people are going to go into Gehenna. And that was because he felt them to be stingy. Kiham gave a case that there was a Jew by the name of Shapsai Bar Marinus, that he ikla Bavel. Stam, it's the region of Bavel, not Surah. He went to Bavel. And Bo Minayu Iska. So the first thing is, ideally, a Yid who doesn't have means, you want to figure out how to make a parnasa. So one of the most common ways of one Yid helping the other make parnasa is to be a soicher, and you give someone merchandise on consignment. It's the easiest thing. Just go to work, go sell. But you don't even need money to invest. So he wanted to get merchandise on consignment. Then the iska will be that when he sells it, the profits will be divided however they agree to. They didn't give him that. Okay, he understood. They didn't trust him. They didn't know him. So if he couldn't do schayra, then he needed a handout. So then when he asked them for food, they didn't give him. And because of that stinginess, he says that they're going to be Yorde Gehenim. Amar Hani Me'erev Rav Ka'asi. Who said that? Mistamish Shapsai. He said these people that live here, they come from the Erev Rav. As it says in Parshas Re'eh regarding Zera Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov, V'nosal L'chorachamim V'rachamecha, that there's a certain level of Rachmanis that God put in the DNA of a Yid. And Kol Hamaracham Al Abriyos, whoever is very merciful, B'yodua, Shohu Mizare Shel Avram Avinu. Even though it goes on all of the Avos, but particularly the Midah of Chesed that we find by Avram Avinu. And in reverse, clear. V'chol mi she'ein merachem al abriyos b'yodua she'einoi mizarei shel Avram Avinu. Oy gewalt. Ve'amar Rav Nosson bar Abba Marab. And that's this is already connected. Kol ha'metzap al shulchan ha'cherim. Whoever needs to look after someone else's table for sustenance, Oilam choshech ba'adoi, that person is living in a dark world. Shenemer, as it says by Iyuv, that if a person is noided hu lelechem, if a person is wandering, looking for bread, asking aye, so yada ki nachan biyada yom choshech, he should know that the day of darkness for him is readily at hand. A day of darkness means he's living in darkness. Amar Rab Chizda, even worse, if a person needs to await for someone else for their sustenance, af chayov einam chayim. And the virtue of either having a profession, the virtue of learning a trade, in other words, to be what's called in English self-employed to a certain degree, or at least you have a profession, to be mitzapa to God directly for your parnasa, and not l'choira, not to be mitzapa al shulchan acherim, and certainly not to need a handout from another person. Tana Rabbanan, Gimel chayim en achayim, ve'elohein. If a person is mitzapa l'shulchan chaveirei, you're looking at someone else's table for your parnas. Number two, umishe ishtoi moishelas olav. His chayim is not whatever that means. And number three, I think people that their ishtois are moishelas olav, the silver lining is that they don't even know it, so they're having a good life. But the observer says, oh my God. Number three, a person who is constantly suffering. If you only have one shirt, what's with only one shirt? So Rashi says that if you only have one shirt, then you can't properly clean it, and therefore the shirt becomes infested with kinim, with lice, and you can't even get rid of it. So Tanakama, why didn't the Tanakama speak about someone who only has one shirt? Because Efshir the Ma'ayin the Monday, it's possible for you to have only one shirt, and for you to go look and find the little louse and to kill the louse, so it's not as convenient as having more than one shirt. But you can't say that Chayov and Chayim, and we can all understand that these Gemaras are a lot deeper than what it sounds like. In every other Gemara, And Hashem should enlighten us to understand this machlokes regarding a shirt. Having one shirt, not having one shirt. Especially if you can understand that levushim are our mitzvahs. Person who has very few mitzvahs, maybe that's what they're speaking about. Says the Mishnah. Weiter. Many details. Tikkun mana and plus. Says the Mishnah, ein shoivrim es acheres. One may not break earthenware or break a shard itself to make a smaller shard. Likewise, ve'ein choinchin hanayor, you may not cut paper. Now, why would you break a cheres or cut paper? Because there are certain food items that are so little, so refined, that if you were to put them directly on fire, they would get burned very quickly. So what they would do is that they would have something that would separate the fire from the food. Sometimes they would make this cheres wet. They would make the paper wet to keep the heat of the fire a little bit removed from the food. Litzleis by moliach. The example is people would do that to roast some salted fish. Why may you not do that? Right, you may not do that because you may not make a keli. You may not make a keli. Tikkun mana. Now the Alter Rebbe, I want you to know from here and other places shows that, hold on, isn't there another issue here of ripping? Koireya. And the answer is, Chevre, that that koireya only means two items that were stuck together that you are ripping apart. That's koireya. One piece of paper, ripping one piece of paper, is not involved in the malacha of koireya. It's the malacha of tikkun mana. In our case, you're ripping a piece of paper. You need that paper to be able to roast something on Yom Tov. Furthermore, regarding tikkun mana, you may not shovel out a tanan and kirayim, which would better its function of you being able to put in their food, and the walls of the tanan and the kirayim and the floor are perfectly flat. There's no protrusions. There's no excess in there, and that's all activities that machshirei oichel nefesh. You would argue, why can't you do it? Because you could have done it before Yom Tov. Avol, even though you can't mamish clear it out, shovel it out, avol mechafshin, but you are allowed to press down the ashes, you are allowed to press down the dirt, to flatten it. That's a tikkun mana with a shinui, and again, you're doing it because the food will come out better if the inside of the tanan and the kirayim is more uniform. Another din, now we're going into building, binyan arai, me'ingen le'ingen, ve'ein makifin shtei chavias, you may not position two barrels together, right? The word makif, I know in Chassidus we use the word makif, but makif, right, that truma you can only take min hamukaf, like for example, which means if I have the same type of product, which are both mechuyev to be tithed, either equally midoraisa, equally midrabanan, they're both equally yafa, they're both equally ra, I can take from one pile on the other as long as they are near each other. That's the mukaf. So here, you're not allowed to put two barrels together in order lishvois aleim asakaderim. You want to cook something. You want to create some sort of that's a great picture. You want to create a stovetop. So what you would do is you would put, let's say, two barrels relatively near each other. You would put wood in between it, obviously in a way where the wood is not going to burn the barrel, but the heat will somehow be retained inside the vacuum between the two barrels. You're going to put a pot on top, and why can't you do that? Because it's binyan arai. Oh, that will be the topic. First we're going to learn about oil arai, then we're going to go into binyan arai, as the Gemara will explain. You're not allowed to do that, but with a shinu you could, as we'll see. Another din, if you have a pot and you want to support it, you want to level it in a certain way, and you need to take wood to level the pot, you may not do it. Now that's a huge statement, and I know we're going to learn that on Daf Lamed Gimel, but already giving a heads up that there is a concept, and I'm going to read the words, Shaloi nitnu eitzim elo lahasaka. You see, now that we are learning about tikkun mana, wood was the most typical item that people would take, and they would do something to it to make it functional. They would sometimes make it into a toothpick. They would make it into an axe. They would make it, not an axe, into a handle. the Chazal were afraid that at the moment you would be allowed to move to handle wood, you're going to do something and you're going to make it functional. You'll make it into a keli. So there was a time where they said, that's the sheet of our Mishnah, that wood can only be used directly for firewood. Now, leveling a pot, even though it's for cooking the pot, but it's not firewood. So even if you're using it in the process of cooking, this Tana holds that lo nitnu eitzim elo lahasok. It's like muksa. And v'chein bedelas. Now v'chein bedelas will leave for the Gemara. It sounds like you may not move wood, to level a door. People would not use wood for a door. A door has to swing back and forth. We're going to learn more details how the Gemara will clarify what this v'chein bedelas means. Another din. You may not drive an animal using a stick. Here the issue, Rashi says, is not about this moving of the stick. Here the issue is that any type of going out on the street with an animal, driving it with a stick, gives it the appearance that you're going to take an animal to the market, you're going to do commerce. However, Reb Shimon, they have no problem. You can take your animal out and walking it, driving it, the way people drive it during the week, which is by leading it with a stick. Again, more pratim about this final machloikas here in the Gemara. Okay, let's begin with the first. The Gemara is going back to the beginning. That you may not break a shard, you may not cut paper. Now, you're not breaking a keli. B'chlal, it's a shard to begin with. We learned we just began today's share that there's no stira by kelim. Here, the problem is not about stira, not about koideya. The problem is tikkun mana. And that's that. Mishum dekam mesaken mana. So when you break something for a purpose, you're being mesaken mana. And this, my friends, just comparing it to a modern question, what happens if a person doesn't have tissue paper or any pre-cut toilet paper regarding cutting toilet paper, ripping toilet paper on Yom Tov? That's the issue over here. I know that sometimes, b'di'evet, some people say, if you have for human dignity, but the issue, even if it's not koireya, and according to the Alter Rebbe, there is no koireya issue by something that's one piece. It's only koireya if you have two pieces of paper that are stuck together and you're ripping it apart. That's koireya. The issue is tikkun mana. Next, you may not shovel out the Tanach and the Kirayim. People would put things inside of it, and not only inside of it, but normally they would put it on its walls. And if there was going to be a lot of ashes or other impurities inside the Tanach and the Kirayim, then the food that you make would not come out as good as. So now the Gemara is going to tell you various opinions regarding this halacha. Tana Rab Chia bar Yosef Kamei de Rav Nachman. He had a Beitzah that says that ve'im efshele efois ele im kein garfoi muter upa. That he says that's not so simple. If you need to do it, you are allowed to do it. What is this Tana versus our Mishnah? So really, that's the question of machshirei yochel nefesh. So when you clear out the oven, that's called tikkun mana. According to Rabbi Yehuda, machshirei yochel nefesh is doiche Yom Tov. That's the Beitzah. Now, obviously, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, if you could have done it before, you also may not do it. But if there is a case that you cooked a lot on Yom Tov, and on Yom Tov it got filled with ashes, it got filled with coals, burnt out coals, now you clear it out. Our Mishnah doesn't say so, because our Mishnah follows the sheet of the Chachamim that machshirei oichel nefesh is not doichem. And now stories. The Visu, the Rab Chia, the wife of Rab Chia, on Yom Tov, one of the bricks or the half a bricks that dislodged itself and fell inside the tanur, from the inside down to the floor of the inside. And Amar lo Rab Chia, listen here, he tells his wife, I want to have good bread. She would bake bread on Yom Tov. He was basically telling her that I follow Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore, since this is machshirei yochel nefesh, it only broke on Yom Tov. So yes, you can clean it out. Another story. Amalei Rava. Lishamoi, Rava tells his attendant, Tavili bar Avza, please roast for me a goose. However, vihizdahar mecharoicha, make sure that it won't get burnt. And again, the way they would make sure it wouldn't get burned is prior to putting in the goose, they would properly shovel out the oven. Again, he paskened like Rabbi Yehuda, and whatever impurity was in the oven was something that was not there prior to Yom Tov, and therefore, since you couldn't have done it before Yom Tov, machshiri yochel nefesh is doicha Yom Tov. That Amalon Rav Acha Muhutza. The Mar, I heard from him that you, meaning you Rav Ashi, Sharkin Leitanu Rabbi Yamatova, that you would spread mud to cover the mouth of the oven, to seal it, for it to retain heat. But here there's another issue. Now, covering the mouth while you're baking, the issue is not tikkun mana, but how would you get the mud if not by you mixing the water and the earth? That's kneading, that's lush. So here again, is there are you allowed to do lush in order to seal the mouth? Is it true that you did that? So Amalei, I want you to know that by me there was no lush b'chlal, because I took the earth, anan araksa de prasamchinan. They lived in the banks, they lived near the Paras river, and the earth near the banks was already very muddy, perfectly fit to seal the mouth of the ovens, and therefore I did not have to make it, it was already made. However, Vahanemili, there was another issue. What's the other issue? Like we have in sand, in a sandbox, which is okay. Sand from the beach is not okay, because it's muksa. How do you resolve muksa? Prior to Yom Tov, you have to designate that earth that you plan to use to seal the mouth of the oven, Hanamile, that that prior to Yom Tov, you already made a mark in the banks of the river of Paras. From here, I'm going to take a shtickle mud to seal my oven. Amar Avina, and if you have no such mud, and now that we are saying that lush is not something you can do on Yom Tov, it's machshirei yochel nefesh. We can paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, but you should have made mud before. So there's another technical, practical solution, and that is uketama shari, that ashes, mixing it with water, which becomes a great sealer for your mouth of the oven, is something that doesn't properly mix with ashes, doesn't properly mix with water, and therefore there is no lush challenge, there's no lush problem. So that would be the option B. That's all before today. Today, just close your oven door and you're good to go. Okay, moving on. Two dots. You may not bring together close two barrels. Can't position close two barrels, and we'll see. Is it because you're making an oil? Because being even though it's arai, but still you may not do it. Amar Rav Nachman, avanim shel beis hakisei mutar letzadadon b'yom tov. That on Yom Tov, if you want to make some sort of makeshift seat to sit on when a person will relieve oneself by bringing two stones near one another, then you are allowed to do it. Oh, so the problem is, how is that different than bringing the two barrels together? So Eisvei Rabba, right, or Rava, to Rav Nachman, and says in our Mishnah, Ein makifin shtei chaviyos, you may not bring near two barrels. Lishpois alema sakadera, to put a pot and to cook on top. So why not? Let's say because you're making an oil. When you're going to put the top, you're making an oil. So if you're putting two stones together, you're going to sit on it. How is that not a problem? So Amalei, I'll tell you, Shani Hassan, Mishum Dekavid Ahala, because when you will actually put the pot on top, even though it's arai, but that's called a proper oil. If you remember, Chevra, a person is not an oil. A person is not an oil. So when you put the two stones together, even if someone is going to sit on that, it's never going to come to an oil. That's why you are allowed to do it. Amalei Rabba Zuta, Rav Ashi, no. Don't understand that the problem is only about oil. Because what would happen if a person is building something that has no hollowed space underneath it, which means what you're putting on top is not a oil, would it be permitted? Elamata bana itztaba, if you're building itztaba means a platform. Here it really means a chair, but not the way you have a chair that under your chair there's a hollow space. What happens if you're building a solid block? You're putting together bricks in order for you to sit on top, but there's nothing underneath it. What will that be allowed on Yom Tiv? Because there's no oil? Of course not. Of course, now I know that whatever it is that you're doing is only arai, so the problem is only of a rabbinic nature, but we know it's asur. So Amalei, you're right. Our Mishnah is not only about oil. No, our Mishnah is about binyan arai. And in our Mishnah, you may not put 2 pots, 2 barrels together. You know why? Because like this, on a biblical level, binyan keva osro toira, binyan arai lo osro toira. However, v'gazru rabbanan al binyan arai mishum binyan keva. And over there, now the problem is, I know that if a person's sitting on 2 rocks, that's not called oil, but that there's a building, you're building something. So now that we have it clear that arai is only midrabanan, if a person needs a more honorable chair to relieve oneself for human dignity, many rabbinic rules were never imposed to begin with. And v'hacha, meaning by the bathroom, mishum kavoidoi, kavod abriyos, loy gazru bei rabana. And therefore, coming back to the itztaba, building an itztaba on Yom Tiv is going to be yasser. Why? Binyan arai. It doesn't have to be an oil. Any temporary building is asur on Yom Tiv. And we're going to leave off over here, but just a heads up that if you remember when we learned the sugya in Shabbos, we learned the difference between building milmaila lamata versus building milmata lamayla, as we'll speak out, God willing, in the next class.